The next person that we have up is a guy that most people in the hemp industry consider a pioneer, almost a superhero in the hemp world, because he's building something that, in my opinion, is just incredibly awesome. One of my motivators in the hemp industry, and that's Bruce Dietzen with the Hemp car.
Thank you, Steve. Actually, you and Bob are my heroes.
Thank you very much.
A couple other heroes too. But, welcome everybody. Everybody enjoying the show? This is really great. I was just so happy to be invited to come here and speak. I think Gene has just done, and his team have done just an incredible job. Just the whole idea of finally doing something that was really focused on industrial hemp. Here in Florida, we have tremendous opportunities in front of us. I'm going to kind of share with you some ideas and some numbers and some math. Wow, that's fun, right? And at the end of which we're going to post it out on the web. And I'm looking for feedback from people because this is such a new industry that a lot of the data isn't necessarily 100% perfect all the time, etc. So, especially guys like Bob and I'd love to get feedback afterwards to see if some of these numbers are right, if they need to be massaged a little bit. So it's an ongoing process, so we figure out how to not necessarily save the planet, but save an inhabitable planet. With that said, my name is Bruce Michael Dietzen. I'm the founder of Renew Design and also carbon negative technology. I'm developing something called carbon negative fiber. And it's based on hemp. We've tried a bunch of different types of hemp, etc. So that's what I focus on a lot. And I'm also the creator of the modern day hemp car. There we go. And that's a picture of the car. It was on Jay Leno's garage a couple years ago. He chased quite a guy. By the way, I did not dress Jay, and he did not dress me. He's wearing a hemp in that shot there. We gave him that shirt. Just a super guy. We had a lot of fun with him. Don't want to be a downer here, but I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about this. The news from the IPCC is pretty frightening. We have a little over a decade left before the IPCC is saying if we don't do something about taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere and getting it down to the point again where it used to be, that we may hit a tipping point and it could be a runaway train. But the key here is it's not just stop the burning of fossil fuels, etc. We actually have to have a mechanism in place within the next decade in order to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, or we're going to be in a world of hurt. We may not be able to turn around. Now, here's something that not everybody is aware of. Perhaps a lot of the folks in this crowd are, but while we're busy trying to figure out how to put a Tesla in our garage, there's a whole sector out there that is generating actually 50% more CO2, more greenhouse gases to be more exact, than the transportation sector, and that's called the industrial sector. And these are the good folks that make everything around us, from the building to the carpeting to our cars to our video cameras, everything that is produced has some sort of embodied carbon, which means basically there's a lot of fossil fuels being burned in the process of making everything around us. And that is actually a problem that's 50% greater than the transportation sector. What's really, really incredible about this is that the industrial sector actually has the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest opportunity to stave off a climate crisis simply by doing what's called carbon avoidance, which means We're no longer going to be making the materials that require a lot of fossil fuels, right? Like cement and steel, and carbon fiber, and fiberglass, and plastic, etc. Instead, we're going to switch over to something that's a carbon negative material, a material that can actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then if you make a durable good out of it, right? Like the chair you're sitting on, or the concrete walls, etc. These are durable goods, right? And like Bob said, they can last longer than the government's. So this is a tremendous it's a tremendous problem. So the solution, right, that is being bandied about by entities like the IPCC is to make everything possible from CO2. Now, here, for those of you that are interested in saving the planet, right, or an inhabitable planet, this, according to the Global Carbon Initiative, by 2030, the overall CO2-based product industry could capture and put to use CO2 equivalent of about 15% of current global emissions. If any of you have ever read the book or seen the book, Drawdown, it talks about the 100 best ways to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, okay? This number right here, according to the Global Carbon Institute, is double. It's twice as much as the most effective way that they chronicle in that book. So that's very impressive. So if you're interested in saving the planet, this is the way to do it. Look at this stuff right here. Now, if you're interested in making a buck, the next thing is pretty important too. By 2030, right, McKinsey and Company did a study by 2030 that this industry of making everything possible from CO2, right? By the way, I haven't even mentioned hemp yet, but just bear with me on this idea of making everything from CO2. Could be worth anywhere from 800 billion to $1 trillion. Now, they're not saying that that market is going to be that big. They're saying that it could be if we get our act together and we decide to save this habitable planet. I keep saying habitable planet because George Carlin, you know, if you ever saw his skit, he said, don't worry about it, you know, the earth is going to save itself. We're all going to be gone. All the birds and the bees and the insects are all going to be gone. The earth's going to be just fine. So what we're really concerned with is taking care of this issue. Within the next decade, we've got to get it done, right? Otherwise, it could be a runaway train. So we can not only do it, but we can also make a whole lot of money if we get serious about it. It can be a very serious business, but a lot of things have to change. And this is another slide from the company CO2 Initiative that engaged McKinsey and Company, and they talked about where some of these opportunities were. I thought a couple of them were very, very interesting here. All of them are, but one of them was the concrete industry, and then also the fiber industry, creating something as an alternative towards carbon fiber right now. I don't know if you know this or not, but carbon fiber is one of the worst materials you can possibly use if you want to help save an inhabitable planet. Every pound of carbon fiber that's manufactured will actually dump at least 20 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's a direct quote on one of the largest carbon fiber manufacturers' websites. I've seen other ones that say it's as much as 48 pounds. So every 1 pound of this carbon fiber, which is supposed to be really, really great stuff, it's going to dump 48 pounds, up to 48 pounds back into CO2. It's terrible. This is a chart from IPCC that talks about various different ways that you can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? And I think it's a couple of years old. There are lots of great ideas that people are talking about, but one of them is something called direct air capture. And I'm going to show that to you in a second. And they were saying a couple of years ago, this is a bit of a problem because it costs $200 or $300 a ton to take a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Got to get the price down, and that's changing. This is one of their machines called direct air capture, right? So we have to ask ourselves a question. We got to do this, right, if we want to stay around on the planet. So how do we capture the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and how much is it going to cost? So direct air capture, you actually build these machines out in the middle of nowhere, and they're like giant fans, and I don't know all the technology about it. I've read something about it, but bottom line is It's already an intriguing idea. It's already being funded to the tune of $200 million. So there's some people behind it. The carbon that comes out of this CO2, it's CO2 that it actually extracts, but the carbon that's in CO2 is only 27%. Now, some of the CO2 can be used just the way it is. In other applications, like if you're going to try to make carbon fiber out of it, you need to split those atoms apart, etc. And so the carbon in there is only 27%. It may need additional processing to separate. There are obviously scalability concerns with this kind of technology, and also it has to be powered by something. And these guys are working very hard to try to take care of those concerns. But the bottom line is they do have this down supposedly, or they think they will soon, all the way down to under $100 per ton of CO2, which being the target. Back to high school. Everybody ready? You got your calculators with you, right? What we're looking at here is our friend CO2, okay? Which has an atomic weight of 44. So it has two parts oxygen, 1 part carbon. Question for you guys. How many times heavier is CO2 than carbon? Anybody raise their hand real quick? The calculator with them? You're going to take 12 divided by 44, right?
44 divided by 12.
44 divided by 12, right? It's 3.67. I hate to bore you with that, but it's going to come back up in the conversation here. Okay, so there's another potential way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere on a cost-effective basis, and it's something that Henry Ford talked about 80 years ago. Okay, dry plants. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea, but dry plants are actually 45% carbon. You and I, we're all 25% carbon. You dry us out into a little pile, and we're 25% carbon. But plants are 45% carbon. And that carbon is derived from the CO2 in the atmosphere. So in order to determine the amount of CO2 that a plant sucks out of the atmosphere, we just have to measure how much carbon is in that plant, in that dry plant material, and then multiply it by 3.67, right? So simple math. So one metric ton of CO2 is equal to this formula right here, 1,336 pounds of plant material. So that's your 0.45, your 45% times 3.67 times 1,336 equals a metric ton, which is 2,204 pounds. Exciting stuff, isn't it? Right? Mathematics. You love it. But anyway, what's nice about this idea of using plants to take CO2 out of the atmosphere is that we're using a source of energy that is free, right? It's the sun. We don't have to build these big sucking machines out in the desert, right, and find how to power them, etc. It's just the sun, right? And of course, it's highly scalable, just like Bob was saying earlier. You've all seen this slide if you're hemp people. It's been around for a long time. And I have it on there just to give you an idea. Sometimes people ask me, well, why do you think hemp is the best plant to use if you're going to take CO2 out of the atmosphere? Well, the reason is it can do all these things and more. And one other thing I want to point out as well, it's the plant that generates THC and CBD, and doggone it, there's a lot of demand for that stuff right now, right? So if you're gonna grow, these cannabinoids for cannabinoids, you're gonna want to use the entire plant. So it's just a perfect thing for that. So here are just a very small sample of some products that can be made. The car that you see there is actually the first production hemp car on the planet. Yay! Henry Ford did one in 1941. Then Lotus did one. Ian Dawson, spoken with Ian a few times. He did one for Lotus. And then some guys up in Alberta did one with Kestrel. They were all great efforts, and then I did mine. And but those were all the prototypes. This one is actually the first production car. So it's not like we're General Motors or anything, but we keep plugging away, and and it actually turned out to be a lighter car than the prototype. In fact, I didn't put this slide in here, but the trunk on this car replaced the trunk on the donor car that was built on. I build these cars on old Miatas, right? Because I don't have billions of dollars. But the trunk lid that I replaced from the Miata weighed 15.7 pounds. The trunk lid on the new car, and when Mazda made that trunk lid, they made it out of aluminum because it would be lighter than steel, right? So they're thinking, we've got a lightweight, get better gas mileage, etc. Okay. The new trunk lid for this car was 8.4 pounds using hemp, okay? Using what I call carbon negative fiber and bioepoxy. That's a 46% reduction in weight over aluminum, which means it's right there at the same performance level in terms of weight as carbon fiber, the most destructive material you can possibly use. You know, if you were to make, I won't mention the names of some of the high-end sports car companies, but some of them make their entire bodies out of carbon fiber. That body might weigh somewhere around 100 pounds, like mine. But the amount of CO2 that's generated by one of these cars that you go out and spend $1 million for, right? That gets dumped into the atmosphere. It can be anywhere from 1 ton to 1.5 tons, right? Nice and lightweight, driving down the street, but you just dumped a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. Great. We're working on a couple of other things. One of these designs here is an e-bike that we're working on right now. There's another one that I want to do if we get the money. You ever seen these giant windmills that are popping up everywhere, the size of football fields, etc.? Guess what they're made out of? Fiberglass, carbon fiber, and aluminum. Here we are trying to save the planet by making windmills, and it takes, I don't know how long, I haven't had a chance to calculate it, but it takes a long time just to pay down the amount of CO2 that gets dumped into the atmosphere by using these types of materials. Absolutely horrendous, incredibly stupid. And there are other types of products, obviously, and Bob had mentioned some of these other types of things. What you're seeing there, I'm working on with a team in Mexico. We're talking about reusable bottles that are made out of hemp starting next year. Working with another team up north in North Carolina with some hemp insulation. There are other companies in Kentucky that are doing hemp board right now, which is interesting. What Bob talked about too was the hempcrete. This is a version of hempcrete on the bottom you see down there, a hempcrete block. And we can do other things as well that I'm very interested in. You see right underneath the car, one of the things that we want to develop are I-beams. I-beams instead of steel. I think we can get them to be just as well, maybe not just as strong, but ample in order to get the job done without dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. It's where we have to go. It's what we have to do. This is the sort of thing we have to do. So here's the bottom line. For direct air capture, which seems to be kind of hot and people are interested in it, it's got $200 million already invested in it, right? 1 metric ton of CO2 is what it pulls out of the atmosphere, and so that's 2,204 pounds, right? And they can do that, they say, for $93 per ton. On the other hand, we've got hemp stalks. These are just raw stalks, right? Because we're talking about raw material. There's no processing in this right now. Obviously, once you start process CO2 or use processing stalks, it's going to increase the cost. So these are just raw material prices. So I've already shown you that 1,300 pounds of hemp is equal to 1 metric ton of CO2, right? And the bottom line of this is, according to USDA, and this is where I really need some help to find out if this number is really real or not, or if it's changing. They're saying that it's $40 to $125 for just raw hemp stock. So if that's the case, but I want to remind you too, there are a lot of places around the country where hemp has already been grown prior to Florida, especially in places like Colorado, where the hemp stalks are just being burned, or they're just rotting away, useless, right? And we can't let that happen here in Florida when we go into the fiber industry, because we've got to figure out how to keep those barns open so that they can dry their CBD or what have you. Exactly, we can't have them filled up with stalks. But the bottom line here is, when you do the math on this, we're talking about 1 ton of CO2 removed from hemp stalks at anywhere from $25 to $76. It's a huge difference. Can you dig that? Can you see what we're talking about here, where we can go with this? It can be the #1 way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you simply get behind it and we make this industry work, we can save the planet. In conclusion, guys, we have to do this. I'm not just talking to the people in this meeting. We're talking about everybody on the planet. We have to understand what the opportunity is, and we have to act right now. Hemp stalks may be our best route to go for carbon capture and utilization. And no one's talking about it around the world right now, hardly at all. They're talking about using machines. And if this happens, if we make it happen, if we save the planet, the people that do so could be part of $1 trillion industry. So the question is, are you on board? Do you believe it? Are you ready to rock and roll?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.